If you were paying any attention at all to the various Best Games of 2025 awards that filled our screens sometime towards the end of last year, then you will have noticed one fairly obvious pattern, namely that Clair Obscur Expedition 33 won basically all of them. It took home Game of the Year in all 5 of the big gaming awards, most recently the BAFTA Games Award. It won something like 500 awards in total, and it was even the 3rd best reviewed title of the year. First if you count stuff that actually came out in 2025. The point is, to say that Clair Obscur is critically acclaimed would be something of an understatement. It won more awards than there are baguettes in France. But despite this, many people across the gaming spectrum were quick to point out that it might not have deserved to win all of them. Obviously, with any gaming award, there's bound to be some sour grapes from fans of the losers, but what makes the objections to Clair Obscur's slate of victories interesting is that they don't focus on the game's graphics, or its performances, or even its gameplay. Instead, critics claim that Expedition 33 didn't deserve to win a particular category because it should never have qualified in the first place. So, let me ask you, did Clair Obscur Expedition 33 deserve to win Best Indie Game? Let's look at some facts. The dictionary definition of indie is any artistic work released by a small team of amateurs without the aid of a publisher. Clair Obscur had a core team of around 30 mostly ex-Ubisoft people plus some contractors, which brings the total figure up to around 100 people on the team. Way more than an amateur project, but way less than a huge AAA game. Expedition 33 also has a publisher in the form of Kepler, but they're a coalition of 8 formerly indie studios who've made stuff like Sifu, Scorn, and Chia, so does that still count? It's not clear. Okay, so if the dictionary definition is a bust, then what about some other games? Well, Baldur's Gate 3, the only other game to also win all 5 big industry awards, is made by Larian, who self-publish, whose entire back catalogue is considered to be all indie games, and who make titles outside the traditional mainstream genres. But BG3 isn't considered indie because it's too high budget? Well, if that's the case, then what about Ark Survival Evolved, a game that has significantly more indie cred, in spite of the fact that it has a vastly larger development budget and is also not very good. That's not super important, I just wanted to mention it. Does that also mean that the billion-dollar self-published Ponzi scheme that is Star Citizen is somehow less indie than the smaller budget Starfield, which was developed and published by industry veterans? Things get even more weird when we try and define indies as countercultural. Annapurna exclusively publishes games that people would swear are indie, but not only are they, a publisher, but the whole company is the vanity project of a multi-billion-dollar heiress, so they're not exactly working outside the system, are they? If LEGO Voyagers is an indie game because it's an Annapurna title, then why isn't LEGO Fortnite, which is self-published? And that's not to mention the fact that many indie titles are considerably more culturally mainstream than anything that venerable publishers have released in years. Nobody playing games gives a crap about the latest big-budget hero shooter flop, but Balatro, an indie game made by a single person, has successfully changed the course of an entire sphere of game development. And for people who say that indie is more about individual creative control, well then, is Hideo Kojima an indie dev? He certainly seems to think he is, and evidently no publisher is telling him how to make games, because his auteur-style weirdness is what's made him one of the industry's most recognisable figures, and has allowed him to become one of its biggest sellouts. Even if it's the hundreds of people working for Kojima Productions that actually make the game. Hell, what about all the games that we think are independent, but are actually owned by gigantic conglomerates, or are made by developers who are just a sneaky satellite arm of a massive, well-established publisher? For some people, so long as a game has pixel art and a farming minigame, then it's indie regardless of any illusions of actual independence. Are you starting to see the problem yet? In case you haven't worked it out yet, I'm not trying to commit to you one way or another on the fairly boring question of whether Clair Obscur deserved to win Best Indie Game or not, and that's because it doesn't really have a satisfying answer. Instead, what I'm trying to point out is that beneath that controversy lies a much more interesting question with much further reaching consequences. And that is, what the hell even is an indie game in the first place? For all the time we in the gaming community spent talking about the rise of indie games, the best indie games, and how indie games might be better or worse than their bigger competitors, it is impossible to come up with a definition of indie game that isn't so full of exceptions, contradictions, and arbitrary rules so as to be essentially useless both as a categorization scheme and as a way of highlighting the things that make indie games special. We can't even define indie games in opposition to anything because the only other word we have to describe the scope and scale of video games is AAA, which is a deliberately vague big marketing term first coined not even by publishers but by games retailers back in the 90s, before the modern indie movement even existed. And the less said about AAA's bastard offspring, AA and quadruple A, the better, because as it turns out, adding a meaningless abstraction on top of a fundamentally meaningless phrase does not cause it to start making more sense. Anyway, if the dictionary definition of indie was ever true back during their initial surge of popularity in around 2008, and let's be clear, it probably wasn't, then it certainly isn't today. And as the line between amateur and professional, and between the gaming mainstream and more niche experiences have become increasingly blurred, it's become harder and harder to talk about games in a way that makes sense. The fundamental problem with these two terms is that they don't really describe anything beyond whether we, subjectively, think a game is quote-unquote mainstream or not, and that means that they're useless for actual serious discussion, and that, invariably, people will keep bending over backwards to justify their gut instincts with silly rules that don't actually make that much sense. But, in spite of me mocking them, I do definitely think that indie and AAA as terms gesture at something real. There is a tactile difference in how big games and small games feel to play. We as a community just struggle to articulate it. And so, in an attempt to break this linguistic deadlock, I want to argue that a game's development scope, which is to say its budget, the size of its intended audience, and especially how many people worked on it, determines far more of what kind of experience it has to offer than whether it has a publisher, whether it was made by a well-known studio, or whether it has a so-called auteur at the helm. And yet we never seem to talk about games in this fashion. The system of pressures and incentives that arise from a game's development context can explain everything from why certain genres only seem to be able to exist at certain development scales, like how no big budget developer has ever really gotten a roguelike right, to how it's weirdly easier to introduce non-gamers to bigger, more expensive titles than it is cheaper, more modestly scoped ones. And thinking about games through this lens can even illuminate some really weird stuff that's puzzled me for ages. Like how Minecraft updates somehow slowed down once the development team ballooned in size, why Souls-likes always seem to be trying to fix Dark Souls rather than giving us more of the stuff we like, and why big budget games never seem to use their massive art teams to do anything more than boring photorealism. To that end, I've tried to organise all of video games into 4 distinct categories, primarily to showcase how massive differences can arise simply by changing the conditions under which games are made, and how in many ways, each echelon of game development size is defined by their limitations more so than any other quality. Now, looking at these 4 poorly named categories, you might be thinking that I've just split a 2-category system into a 4-category system, and let's be frank, you'd be partially correct. But I think looking at games through the lens of their scope, rather than judging them based on abstract qualities, helps to illuminate their differences and their similarities much more clearly, allowing us to organise games in a way that makes much more sense, and also helps us to deal with quite a lot of those weird edge cases that serve only to get in the way and cause a bunch of really tedious debates over what counts as a publisher or not. Anyway, let's start at the top with blockbuster games, which are defined by being the biggest titles out there, and it's the sheer amount of man-hours put into every blockbuster game that allows them to realise levels of detail and fidelity that other games simply can't match, because it wouldn't be an efficient use of their time to, for example, simulate the thermodynamics of horse testicles. But blockbuster games, on the other hand, have the resources to commit to this level of consistently high fidelity, and can pay small armies of developers to polish every square inch of a game to a mirror shine, making them easy to get into and incredibly smooth to play. What this ultimately means is that blockbuster titles naturally lend themselves to experiences that rely on spectacle and immersion, open worlds, cinematic adventure games, and stuff like multiplayer titles that require a lot of money just to keep running. Something like Cyberpunk only works because there is a huge amount of flashy, instantly accessible content available basically anywhere you look, and mega live service games need a constant drip feed of new game modes, skins, and in the case of gacha stuff, suspiciously young looking women that very few developers or people allowed within 500 meters of a school can safely commit to. However, all this fidelity and polish does come at a price, mostly in the form of a lot of money. And this means that blockbuster games are as much limited by their scale as they are empowered by it. In order to have any hope of breaking even on such massive projects, blockbuster games need to target wide audiences, and that means that they're forced to play to broad, crowd-pleasing ideas, because anything too specific might serve to put a potential customer off. They're like the Marvel movies or the McDonald's of games. Relatedly, this is why many blockbuster titles have fairly safe visual direction in spite of their massive art budgets, and why they seem to have a bunch of cherry-picked ideas from a bunch of different places rather than a single coherent identity. It's because they're trying to show off their size and budget in order to appeal to everyone, rather than exclusively marketing to a small clientele. And without a strong directorial hand to steer such massive projects, it can lead to blockbusters becoming this amorphous blob of wishy-washy ideas instead of a showcase of the best the industry has to offer. It's only by sacrificing the pageantry of the blockbuster that games are allowed to zero in a bit. And that's why what I'm calling enterprise titles, due to their professionalism and not due to Star Trek, have a much more distinct identity. And it's because of this tighter focus that you can spot a Hazelight or an RGG or a Remedy game from a mile off. However, this freedom also brings with it additional risks. Unlike blockbusters, which are few in number and that compete over everyone, smaller enterprise games are much more numerous and are each fighting over a single slice of the pie in the form of a particular genre, meaning that this tier of game development is much more cutthroat than everything else. Look at Souls-likes, for example, a classic enterprise-level genre. Every single Soulsy title is desperate not to stand on its own merits, but to tell you why it's better than Dark Souls. And it's the ones that make the most compelling case that ultimately succeed. Lies of P presents a mechanical improvement on several long-standing design gripes of the genre, Remnant fixes Dark Souls' historically terrible ranged combat, and Jedi Fallen Order does the impossible by making a Souls game with a comprehensible story. Basically, enterprise games are defined by competition. Constrained to a single genre, but still with multi-million-dollar budgets, they need to secure a market niche or supplant a competitor in order to survive, and this leads to design that's much more concerned with building and improving on what came before over straight-up innovation. Whether it's Horde survival games all trying to be the next Left 4 Dead, or Arc Raiders and Marathon both trying in different ways to pivot the oppressive extraction shooter template into more accessible directions, there is a real sense of evolution and growth to enterprise games that you just don't get in the more sedentary blockbusters and the more freeform smaller tiers. With the iterative growth in something like the first-person shooter, with games adapting to what works and trying to outcompete the rest being easy to trace over time. Of course, this does mean that truly novel design is often quite hard to find in enterprise games. Studios capable of fighting for dominance in a whole genre often can't afford to take too many risks, and this can lead to them hewing quite closely to established genre conventions, as we can see in stuff like action horror games or digital trading card games. If the high-stakes world of enterprise stuff is about a fight for vertical movement in a dog-eat-dog world, then boutique titles are much more focused on lateral growth instead. By trading away large-scale production pipelines and the predictability of genre fundamentals, boutique games, so named for their specialized scope, gain vastly more agility and precision when it comes to design, because they aren't weighed down by the bureaucracy that comes with any large-scale operation. Due to their narrow, precise scope, there's much less direct competition between individual boutique titles, and a lot can squeeze into the same genre niche. Success in the boutique space is less about winning the fight and much more about standing out, and that's why the most successful boutique games use their tight focus to create novel experiences that reinterpret staple concepts in cool new ways, with their smaller budget allowing each game to take much bigger creative swings. Something like Supergiant's Pyre, the visual novel RTS basketball hybrid game, would have bankrupted a larger studio or may never have gotten made at all, but boutique games have the freedom to experiment, allowing stuff like this to exist, admittedly at the risk of no one being interested. This is why puzzle games, management titles, and roguelikes are also present in the boutique space. These are tried and tested formats that devs can layer a unique gimmick on top of to create a new experience very easily, forming just one of many smaller dishes that live side by side in the boutique buffet. Take Boomer Shooters for example. Do you want a nostalgia trip? Yep, they've got you covered. A Devil May Cry spectacle fighter? They've got that too. A rhythm game? Yeah, sure, why not? The obligatory 40k skin on a fairly generic game? Do you even have to ask? However, this isn't to say the boutique titles are necessarily fonts of creativity. For every Outer Wilds that takes a venerable format in wild, new, interesting directions, the reactivity of the space also allows developers to pump out millions of borderline clones of popular concepts. Just look at how many bootlegs there are of Slay the Spire and Hades. Just like with other scopes of games, the advantages of boutique titles also define their limitations. Because the space is built on remixes and reimaginings, it can be difficult for any one game to stand out, and most boutique developers lack the resources, talent, or luck to build something that can rise above the churn of similar titles and become a household name. This leads me, finally, onto outsider games, which might sound like an insult, but it really isn't. What I mean by outsider isn't games made by this guy, I mean games made by tiny teams with next to no budget at all, total amateurs, and generally people working more or less completely outside the professional game development ecosystem. The defining limitation of these smallest scale games is the fact that they are almost never well-rounded experiences. Outsider developers frequently don't have the luxury of a budget for polishing or expertise in key areas like art or programming or playtesting, resulting in experiences characterized by what they lack just as much as what they contain. And it's this that gives them a uniquely intimate and personal feel compared to other larger scope titles, and it's what frees them up to sometimes get really weird. For some examples of outsider games that made it big, Hollow Knight, Stardew Valley, or Undertale would all definitely count. These games work because they function in spite of their technical shortcomings and with their weird design quirks, like the fact that there isn't a single slope or curved surface in all of Hallownest because the devs didn't know how to make them until Silksong. Playing an outsider game is a look into a single person or a small team's passions, influences, and unfiltered intent, and this means that they frequently break game design rules either accidentally or on purpose. No larger studio could have made something like the standoffish Blueprints, or the sacrilegious Binding of Isaac, or the unbearably pretentious The Witness, because all these titles are defined as much by their flaws and idiosyncrasies as they are by the stuff they do really well, and that can only come from a design vision so focused that it wasn't really made for anyone other than the designer themselves. As a result, it's no surprise that many of the best outsider games are the ones that lean into their design limitations by focusing on retro aesthetics with more primitive graphics, or sticking to genres that don't require lots of complex systems design or massive environments, like narrative games, puzzlers, and horror stuff. All themes which to some extent provide some wiggle room for bad graphics or simplistic gameplay and work best in a short form factor. Something that stands in contrast to bigger genres with more baggage that tend to overshadow the personal touches that make outsider games so unique. And that, I think, is the biggest, most important takeaway from this weird, poorly named system that I've come up with. The scale of any game development project affects so much more of the player experience than its price, but without looking into this stuff or thinking about it more critically, it can be completely invisible, and that leads to us missing depth and context that can help us appreciate why we like certain games and why others miss the mark. Consider, for example, how particular genres, by virtue of whether they focus on breadth or depth and whether they prioritize high or low concept design, fit more naturally into different tiers of game development. When developers try to execute on a concept with a bigger or smaller scope than we're used to, it can drastically change how familiar ideas look, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worst. This is very true for nostalgia games. It's interesting that such a universal emotion manifests in the design of very different experiences at different scales of development. High-end nostalgia games leverage big budgets and the benefit of industry expertise to recreate the original vision of old games using new technology and updated design principles, whereas smaller teams tackling the same ideas focus instead on creating the feeling of playing these old games with authentic-seeming graphics and old-school design that is unpalatable to mainstream audiences but refreshing to die-hard fans, taking the audience into the past rather than pulling the games into the present. Another example of how scope changes particular genres can be seen in platformers. Back in the day, when jump-em-ups lived at the upper ends of the development scale, they were typically designed as quite simple, almost theme-parky experiences that relied on giving players a fun ride through evocative worlds filled with tactile mechanics, because that's what mass audiences enjoy, something we can still see today in Nintendo's output or the Astro Bot games, which have a continued focus on light, breezy level concepts, which comprise a conveyor belt of mostly throwaway gimmicks. However, with the indie revolution in the late noughties, smaller team sizes and a lack of pressure to appeal to everyone allowed platformers to fracture and branch into a bunch of mini-genres that would have never been commercially viable at larger scales. Maso-core platformers like Celeste and Super Meat Boy, puzzle platformers like Fez and Braid, and titles that experimented with the form of platformers as a whole, like Mirror's Edge and Spelunky, took the same ideas in new directions thanks to a change in perspective. By contrast, half the reason why many games fail to make an impact is that they target types of experience with either too large or too small a scope. Obsidian's Avowed and Outer Worlds are perfectly okay games, but they're aiming for a blockbuster experience that they simply don't have the development resources to fully realise. And I thought legendary flop Immortals of Avon was a pretty good game. People just made the mistake of giving a $100 million budget to a relatively narrow concept, meaning the game feels a bit overstuffed, and there was no way it was ever going to be financially viable, even if it wasn't overshadowed by other, better games. Of course, this isn't to say that companies, games and genres have fixed positions in terms of their development scope. Something like CD Projekt has had a visible journey from the outsider fringes all the way to the world of blockbusters over the last 20 years. And even games themselves can start off as weird, isolated solo projects and morph over time into larger scale operations. Roguelikes were once purely the domain of the outsider sphere, but over time as the format has evolved, it's become a great foundation for boutique titles to layer unique premises on top of. But roguelikes of the genre haven't translated anywhere near as well into bigger scope games, because the foundations of the genre serve to benefit smaller studios. Procedural generation means you don't need to tailor-make lots of levels, and the core progression structure of mastering systems and gaining knowledge creates some inherent early friction that casual audiences don't want to deal with. The only real enterprise-level attempts at a roguelike have been Returnal and Saros, both of which are kind of weirdly structured, linear, story-based experiences which are pretty good, but constantly feel like they're fighting the roguelike premise and what mass audiences actually enjoy. and Minecraft has had a really weird journey. Back when it started as a one-person project by Hatsune Miku, the game's idiosyncrasies that resulted from its tiny development scope, like its lack of guidance, its iconic weird-looking creatures, and its nonsense broken systems like infinite water sources, eventually ended up contributing heavily to the game's success. But as more Vocaloids were added to the team, and the breadth of Minecraft's audience has expanded into more casual spaces, not only has development slowed to a crawl, because each decision now needs to go through more people, but the weird, half-broken rough edges and big creative swings that made the game famous can now never emerge. Because what was once an intimate outsider game is now a massive Microsoft-published blockbuster. Though, in fitting with what I've been talking about the whole time, the much smaller scale of Minecraft's modding scene has led to the creation of some crazy, technically mind-boggling nonsense simply could have never appeared within the context of Microsoft's direct oversight, but are equally almost impenetrable without a wiki and tend to break more or less all the time. I guess what I'm saying here, and to finally get back to the ostensible topic of the video, is that while it might seem like I've spent ages getting way too invested in arcane technical definitions, it's important to remember that language shapes the way we think. By reducing all games ever into just two diametrically opposed and extreme groups with vague definitions, we can only ever think about games in terms of those two categories, of gigantic AAA juggernauts made exclusively with profit in mind and no artistry whatsoever that are somehow, paradoxically, the only games allowed to be taken seriously, and tiny indie amateur projects with all the creativity made purely with altruistic intent that can never be real video games no matter how hard they try, because they weren't made by a big company. These definitions might seem extreme, but this is where AAA and indie discourse ultimately leads. It obliterates nuance and obscures the far more important differences between how games get made and how they feel to play, and generally causes a bunch of problems. Most obviously, our lack of a proper gaming taxonomy plays havoc with our expectations. It's absolutely not fair to compare the likes of Path of Exile 2 to, say, No Rest for the Wicked, which is an order of magnitude smaller. Nor that to Grim Dawn, which is even smaller again, and it's not fair to compare Grim Dawn to a teeny tiny game like Chronicom. All of these Diablo ripoffs might be technically indie, but they're operating at totally different scales and thus provide totally different experiences. If you boot up this pixel art game made by two people and expect infinite endgame content and ultra smooth accessible gameplay, then of course you're going to be disappointed. And if you look at a big game and expect it to be hyper-tailored to your very specific tastes, or to be taking daring game design risks, then you're also going to never get what you're looking for, indie or not. Indie games as an idea being nothing more than a vague signifier of something being countercultural also allows big companies with all the money in the world to cynically co-opt the surface level aesthetic of indie games in an attempt to muscle out actual smaller developers, resulting in games that seem indie but don't have the same level of intimacy or bespoke design that authentically small scoped games have. And for said tiny studios, it can often feel like the only way to be taken seriously by the mainstream gaming establishment is to make a shiny, linear, cinematic game with celebrity stunt casting front and center, or a big open world with 100 hours of playtime, because that sort of stuff is what quote-unquote real AAA games have. After all, it's no surprise that Clair Obscur was accepted into the mainstream gaming establishment fold, and other games with the same ambitions weren't, when you consider that it looks and feels like a high-budget mainstream game, and its equally inventive, moving, and strikingly designed peers don't. But, perhaps worst of all, viewing different scales of games as monoliths can serve to stifle variety. If you're wondering where middle-of-the-road games have gone, the stuff that focuses on fully exploring a handful of rich ideas rather than leaning on novelty or polish, the sort of stuff that idiots would call AA, then you need only look to a gaming ecosystem that sees only tiny, cheap, throwaway indie games and massive, sprawling AAA juggernauts, with ever-decreasing room in the middle for stuff that balances breadth and depth. And I think that's why Clair Obscur and games like it have caused such a stir, such that I'm still talking about it more than a year after it came out. Clair Obscur is an obviously great game, but one that doesn't map onto the binary that's come to dominate our discourse. It's a game that leverages a large, talented team to create an elegantly designed, streamlined gameplay experience, but equally, it takes some bold design risks in matching up ideas from multiple different places, harkening back to the experimental, active time battle RPGs of the early to mid-noughties, stuff like Shadow Hearts, Eternal Sonata, and Final Fantasy X. And as a result, Expedition 33 doesn't fit neatly into either camp, and that's because it isn't in either. It's not AAA, and it's not an indie game. To my mind, Clair Obscur is firmly an enterprise game, and its strengths and its weaknesses reflect that. It isn't doing anything too groundbreaking, and it's got some weird, clunky bits and elements where its visuals don't quite work, but its attempts to refine existing ideas let it take advantage of a gap in the market that's gone ignored by other big JRPG studios, which have either moved into the bigger blockbuster space and started leaning on size and spectacle, or have moved down into making boutique games to service specific fans. Clair Obscur is a game that exists in defiance of the way we usually talk about games, and that is why it's gripped people so much, even if I, personally, think that it's a tad overrated. And more so than anything else, it highlights the insanity of arguing about what counts as a publisher or how many A's a game needs to have before it's okay to pirate it. The art of making games is far more complex, more fraught with risk, and more interesting than we on the consumer side ever really think about. And that's a shame, because in devolving into petty tribalism, in bifurcating all video games into two groups that have no clear distinction, we create a world where nuance and depth cannot exist, and where we fail to appreciate what makes the best game special and what allows them to exist at all. When a game with an amazing art style comes out of a tiny studio, it's all the more impressive because it's probably coming from just one insanely overworked artist. And when a big mainstream game wows us with a cool set piece, it's not fair to pin it on one overhyped auteur when it was probably the work of a whole team working in unison over several years. Publishers, far from being the enemy of creativity, are in many cases what allow games in the boutique and outsider spaces to exist at all. Without people like Hooded Horse taking a chance on what would otherwise be long shots, then indie strategy games basically wouldn't exist. And now, as formerly small studios are stepping up to finance the new generation of up-and-comer amateurs, the grassroots scene is reclaiming development space abandoned by the big publishers and their venture capital ghoul overlords, who are the ones that we should be saving our anger for. And when a smaller studio moves up to the big leagues, or a mainstream dev forms their own tiny studio, it isn't a betrayal of the indie scene or a fall from grace, it's just people changing the scope that they're working in so as to create new games that they couldn't before. And that's infinitely preferable to them not taking any risks at all. So, when next you're talking, or thinking, or writing about games, and you're stuck wondering whether something belongs in the AAA or indie category, take a moment and just consider that this binary framework might not be as sensible or helpful as it seems. Sometimes, we just need to remember to look at games in terms of their wider development context, that we shouldn't just judge all games by the same standards, and, most importantly of all, that if you catch someone using the terms AA or quadruple-A, then you should find them in real life and throw something hard at their head. And then, when the police find you, simply explain to them that a person on the internet told you to do it, and it'll be fine. I promise. Hello, and oh my god, what year is it? Yep, sorry, this one's so late. I tried to make a big video about Clair Obscur, and it just did not work, and then I got sick for a bit, and so this is the consolation prize. Sorry. Anyway, this is the after the video segment, that part of every video where we have a little chat about some stuff that I need to tell you, and also some apologies, apparently. In particular, I very much want to focus on highlighting a cool person from the internet that you might not be aware of, and this time, it's Chris Zukowski of How to Market a Game. So, this website, and Chris's whole deal in general, might seem like very dry stuff and not super relevant if, like me, you have no intent on marketing a game anytime soon, but it's actually super interesting. And he's got a great way of cleanly and concisely explaining how the behind the scenes of the Steam ecosystem works, and how various genres are rising and falling over time, as well as what's causing them to be more or less popular, and all that good stuff. There are some genuinely really valuable insights here, and I based some of this video on some of the interesting things Chris pointed out, so if you're an indie dev, I highly recommend checking it out, but for everyone else, I think it's very interesting reading too. Go give it a look. Of course, if you want even more interesting reading, then hey, give the channel a few bucks on Patreon or YouTube memberships, because that is the best way to get even more sweet content from yours truly. Just a couple of bucks gets you behind the scenes stuff, extra game design musings from every video that I had to cut, bonus game recommendations from my Games You Should Have Played series, early access to videos, your name in the credits. It's pretty good value. Of course, if you want to support the channel without giving me any cash, then all you've got to do is tell your friends, post a comment, share links, like, comment, subscribe, dingle the bell, or whatever, you know, that sort of stuff, and also watching the video all the way through, because that's where I put the names of my top tier supporters who deserve all the praise they can get. And they are Ali Wright, Andrew Labrano, Auna94, Baroness Caroline, Bobby, Constantine Amend, Cosmic360, Daniel Medjes, Daniel Ursin, Dirk Jan Karenbeld, Digleteer, Dis Ellie, Ekton, Edward Franklin Woods, Edwina the Space Bun, Eric Woolston, Eugene Bulkin, Fuck It's Job, Fulibaxi, Gazkul, How, Heck It's Noah, I Support Trans Rights, I'm So Glad You Weren't Eaten, Jacob Dylan Riddle, Jinkaloid, Kevin Help Us, Konolov, Kangi, Leap Year Every Day, Luke Kokoran, Macewinder54, Mark Vallant, Mika Oi, Michael C, Mike Oxlong, Nate Graff, Oliver Marhofer, Patrick Romberg, Peter Tomasic, Reddedex, Regal Regex, Seslux, Silver Folfy, Toak, Tyler Duncan, Timotheus Beksek, Whimsical Wisp, Zach Brandmeier, and Chow. Okay, that's it from me. I'll see you when I see you. Enjoy the rest of Pride. Bye!